Transportation facilities. 2 successive dry years had greatly reduced the water level of Lily Lake, and the consequent shallowness of the water made a serious situation for its beaver inhabitants. This lake covered about 10 acres and was 4 feet deep in the deepest part, while over 9/10 of the area the water was 2 feet or less in depth. It was supplied by springs. Early in the autumn of 1911, the water completely disappeared from about 1/2 of the area, and most of the remainder became so shallow that beaver could no longer swim beneath the surface. This condition exposed them to the attack of enemies and made the transportation of supplies to the house slow and difficult. In the lake, the beaver had dug an extensive system of deep canals, the work of years. By means of these deep canals, the beaver were able to use the place until the last, for these were full of water even after the lake bed was completely exposed. One day in October, while passing the lake, I noticed a coyote on the farther shore suddenly stop, prick up his ears, and give alert attention to an agitated forward movement in the shallow water of a canal. Then he plunged into the water and endeavored to seize a beaver that was struggling forward through water that was too shallow for his heavy body. Although this beaver made his escape, other members of the colony may not have been so fortunate. The drought continued, and by mid-October the lake went entirely dry except in the canals. Off in one corner stood the beaver house, a tiny rounded and solitary hill in the miniature black plain of lake bed. With one exception, the beaver abandoned the site and moved on to other scenes, I know not where. One old beaver remained. Whether he did this through the fear of not being equal to the overland journey across the dry rocky ridge and down into Wind River, or whether from deep love of the old home associations, no one can say. But he remained and endeavored to make provision for the coming winter. Close to the house he dug an enlarged well that was about 6 feet in diameter and 4 feet in depth. Seepage filled this hole, and into it he piled a number of green aspen chunks and cuttings, a meager food supply for the long cold winter that followed. Extreme cold began in early November, and not until April was there a thaw. Before the lake bed was snow-covered, all the numerous canals and basins which the beaver had excavated could be plainly seen and examined. The magnitude of the work which the beaver had performed in making these is beyond comprehension. I took a series of photographs of these excavations and made numerous measurements. To the north of the house, a pool had been dug that was 3 feet deep, 30 feet long, and about 20 wide. There extended from this a canal that was 150 feet long. The food basin was 30 feet wide and 4 feet deep. This had a canal connection with the house. In the bottom of the basin was one of the feeble springs which supply the lake. Another canal, which extended 350 feet in a northerly direction from the house, was from 3 to 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep. The largest ditch or canal was 750 feet long and 3 feet deep throughout. This extended eastward, then northeasterly, and for 100 feet was 5 feet wide. In the remaining 650 feet it was 3 to 4 feet wide. There were a number of minor ditches and canals connecting the larger ones, and altogether the extent of all made an impressive show in the empty lake basin. Meantime the old beaver had a hard winter. The cold weather persisted, and finally the well in which he had deposited winter food froze to the bottom. Even the entrance hole into the house were frozen shut. This sealed him in. The old fellow, whose teeth were worn and whose claws were bad, apparently tried in vain to break out. On returning from 3 months' absence, 2 friends and I investigated the old beaver's condition. We broke through the frozen walls of the house and crawled in. The old fellow was still alive, though greatly emaciated. For some time, I know not how long, He had subsisted on the wood and the bark of some green sticks which had been built into an addition of the house during the autumn. We cut several green aspens into short lengths and threw them into the house. The broken hole was then closed. The old fellow accepted these cheerfully. For 6 weeks aspens were occasionally thrown to him, and at the end of this time the spring warmth had melted the deep snow. The water rose and filled the pond and unsealed the entrance to the house, and again the old fellow emerged into the water. The following summer he was joined or rejoined by a number of other beaver. In many localities the canals or ditches dug and used by the beaver form their most necessary and extensive works. These canals require enormous labor and much skill. In point of interest, they even excel the house and the dam. It is remarkable that of the thousands of stories concerning the beaver, only a few have mentioned the beaver canals. These are labor-saving improvements and not only enable the beaver to live easily and safely in places where he otherwise could not live at all, but apparently they allow him to live happily. The excavations made in taking material for house or dam commonly are turned to useful purpose. The beaver not only builds his mound-like house, but uses the basin thus formed in excavating earthy material for the house for a winter food depository. Ofttimes, too, in building the dam, he does it by piling up the material dug from a ditch which runs parallel and close to the dam, and which is useful to him as a deep waterway after the dam is completed. In transporting trees for food supply, water transportation is so much easier and safer than land that wherever the immediate surroundings of the pond are comparatively level, the beaver endeavors to lead water out to tree groves by digging a canal from the edge of the pond to these groves. The felled trees are by this means easily floated into the pond. One of the simplest forms of beaver canal is a narrow outward extension of the pond. This varies in length from a few yards to 100 feet or more. Another and fairly common form of canal is one that is built across low, narrow necks of land which thrust out into large beaver ponds, or on narrow stretches of land around which crooked streams wander. The majority of beaver ponds are comparatively shallow over the greater portion of their area. In many cases, it is not easy or even possible to deepen them. They may be so shallow that the pond freezes to the bottom in winter except in its small, deeper portion. The shallow ponds are made more usable by a number of canals in the bottom. These canals assure deep water stretches under all conditions. Most beaver ponds have a canal that closely parallels the dam. In some instances, this is extended around the pond a few yards inside the shoreline. 2 canals usually extend from the house. One of these connects with the canal by the dam. The other runs to the place on the shore, commonly at the end of a trail or slide, most visited by the beaver. In Jefferson Valley, Montana, not far from Three Forks, I enjoyed the examination of numerous beaver workings and made measurements of the most interesting system of beaver canals that I have ever seen. The beaver house for which these canals did service was situated on the south bank of the river, about 3 feet above the summer level of the water and about 200 feet north of the hilly edge of the valley. From the river, a crescent-shaped canal, about 35 feet in length, had been dug halfway around the base of the house. Connected with this was a basin for winter food. This was 5 feet deep and 35 feet in diameter. From this, a canal extended southward 207 feet. 110 feet distant from the house was a boulder that was about 10 feet in diameter. This was embedded in about 2 feet of soil. Around this boulder, the canal made a detour and then resumed its comparatively straight line southward. Over the greater portion of its length, this canal was 4 feet wide, and at no point was it narrower than 3 feet. Its average depth was 28 inches. For 147 feet, it ran through an approximately level stretch of the valley, and seepage filled it with water. A low, semicircular dam, about 50 feet in length, crossed it at the 147-foot mark, and served to catch and run seepage water into it, and also to act as a wall across the canal to hold the water. The most southerly 60 feet of this canal on the edge of the foothills ran uphill and was about 4 feet deep at the upper end, 4 feet higher than the end by the house. The dam across it was supplemented by a wall 48 feet further on. This wall was simply a short dam across the canal in a part that was inclined and plainly for the purpose of retaining water in the canal. The upper part of the canal was filled with water by a streamlet from off the slope. Apparently this canal was old, for there was growing on its banks near the house a spruce tree 4 inches in diameter that had grown since the canal was made. The wall or small dam which beaver build across canals that are inclined represents an interesting phase of beaver development. That these walls are built for the purpose of retaining water in the canal appears certain. They are most numerous in canals of steepest incline, though rarely less than 20 feet apart. I have not seen a wall in an almost dead level canal, except it was there for the purpose of raising the height of the water. This wall or buttress is after all but a dam, and like most dams it is built for the purpose of raising and maintaining the level of water. Extending at right angles westward from the end of the old canal was a newer one of 221 feet. A wall separated and united the two. 160 feet of this new canal ran along the contour of a hill approximately at a dead level. Then came a wall, and from this the last 61 feet extended southward up a shallow ravine. In this part there were 2 walls. The upper end of the 61-foot extension was 9 feet higher than the house, and 428 feet distant from it. The 221-foot extension was from 26 to 34 inches wide and averaged 22 inches deep. The entire new part was supplied with spring water, which the beaver had diverted from a ravine to the west and led by a 70-foot ditch into the upper end of their canal. 30 feet from the end of the canal were 2 burrows, evidently safe places into which the beaver could retreat in case of sudden attack from wolves or other foe. There were 2 other of these burrows, one at the outer end of the old canal, and the other alongside the boulder 110 feet from the house. At the time I saw these canals, the only trees near were those of an aspen grove which surrounded the extreme end. It was autumn, and on both tributary slopes by the end of the canal, aspens were being cut, dragged, and rolled down these slopes into the upper end of the canal, then floated through its waters, dragged over and across the walls, and at last piled up for winter food in the basin by the house. In all probability, this long, large canal had been built a few yards at a time, being extended as the trees nearby were cut down and used. Where beaver long inhabit a locality, it is not uncommon for them to have 2 or 3 distinct and well-used trails from points on the water's edge, which lead into neighboring groves or tree clumps. These are the beaten tracks traveled by the beaver as they go forth from the water for food, and over which they drag their trees and saplings into the water. On steep slopes by the water, these are called slides. This name is also given to places in the dam over which beaver frequently pass in their outgoings and incomings. Commonly, these trails avoid ridges and ground swells by keeping in the bottom of a ravine. Logs are cut through and rolled out of the way, or a tunnel driven beneath. Obstructions are removed or a good way made round them. Their log roads compare favorably with the log roads of woodsmen who cut with steel instead of enamel. In most old beaver colonies, where the character of the bottom of the pond permits it, There are 2 or more tunnels or subways beneath the floor of the principal pond. The main tunnel begins close to the foundation of the house and penetrates the earth a foot or more beneath the water to a point on land a few feet beyond the shoreline. If there are a number of small ponds in a colony that are separated by fingers of land, it is not uncommon for these bits of land to be penetrated by a thoroughfare tunnel. These tunnels through the separating bits of land enable the beaver to go from one pond to the other without exposing themselves to dangers on land, and also offer an easy means of intercommunication between ponds when these are ice-covered. Pond subways also afford a place of refuge or a means of escape in case the house is destroyed, the dam broken, or the pond drained, or in case the pond should freeze to the bottom. Commonly these are full of water, but some are empty. On the Missouri and other rivers where there are several feet of cut banks above the water, beaver commonly dug a steeply inclined tunnel from the river's edge to the top of the bank a few feet back. Most of this tunnel work is hidden and remains unknown. A striking example was in the spruce tree colony elsewhere described. These colonists, apparently disgusted by having their ponds completely filled with sediment which came down as the result of a cloudburst, abandoned the old colony site. A new site was selected on a moraine only a short distance from the old one. Here in the sod a basin was scooped out and a dam made with the excavated material. The waters from a spring which burst forth in the moraine about 200 yards up the slope and perhaps 100 feet above, trickled down and in due time formed a pond. The following year this pond was enlarged and another one built upon a terrace about 100 feet up the slope. From year to year there were enlargements of the old pond and the building of new pondlets until there were 7 on the terraces of this moraine. These, together with the connecting slides and canals, required more water than the springs supplied, especially in the autumn when the beaver were floating their winter supplies from pond to pond. Within the colony area, too, were many water-filled underground passages or subway tunnels. One of these penetrated the turf beneath the willows for more than 200 feet. While watching the autumnal activities of this colony, as described in another chapter, I broke through the surface and plunged my leg into an underground channel or subway that was half filled with water. Taking pains to trace this stream downward, I found that it emptied into the uppermost of the ponds along with the waters from a small spring. Then, tracing the channel upwards, I found that, about 140 feet distant from the uppermost pond, it connected with the waters of the brook on which the old colony formerly had a place. This tunnel over most of its course was about 2 feet beneath the surface, was 14 inches in diameter, and ran beneath the roots of spruce trees. The water which the tunnel led from the brook plainly was being used to increase the supply needed in the canals, ponds, and pools of the spruce tree colony. The intake of this was in a tiny pond which the beaver had formed by a damlet across the brook. That this increased supply of water was of great advantage to the busy and populous spruce tree colony there can be no doubt. Was this tunnel planned and made for this especial purpose, or was the increased water supply of the colony the result of accident by the brooks breaking into this subway tunnel? The canals which beaver dig, the slides which they use, the trails which they clear and establish conclusively show that these animals appreciate the importance of good waterways and good roads, in other words, good transportation facilities.